They told you Elizabeth I was laid to rest with honor inside Westminster Abbey more than 4 centuries ago, wrapped in velvet dignity and sealed beneath a marble queen's tomb. But what they never told you, what they will never willingly admit, is far more unsettling than any ghost story. Her skeleton, the one piece of physical evidence that could confirm or destroy the legend of the Virgin Queen, has never been examined. Not once. Not by archaeologists, not by forensic scientists, not by the modern technologies that have cracked open the mysteries of pharaohs, medieval kings, and nameless skeletons pulled from riverbeds. Richard III was dragged out from under a parking lot and sliced open by CT scanners. Egyptian mummies have been unwrapped molecule by molecule. Royal tombs all across Europe have been opened, studied, and cataloged. But Elizabeth, her coffin has stayed shut, untouched, untouchable, untouchably guarded for 420 years. And the question that gnaws at the edges of midnight isn't why they kept her hidden in the past, it's why they're still hiding her today. Every request, every formal petition, every scholarly proposal, every promise to use non-invasive scanners that wouldn't even require opening the coffin has been denied without hesitation. Not delayed, not debated, flatly shut down. Respect for the dead, they claim, a phrase rolled out so quickly and so conveniently that it collapses under its own weight. If respect were really the standard, Henry VII's tomb wouldn't have been opened. Richard III wouldn't have been exhumed. Ancient kings and queens wouldn't have been dissected by MRI machines. Respect was never the issue. Fear was, because bones don't lie. Bones have no loyalty to myths. Bones don't protect reputations. Bones don't care about the politics of a kingdom that no longer exists. Bones simply tell the truth written into them. And what those bones, especially the bones of the pelvis, could reveal about Elizabeth I would rewrite English history forever. Before we even reach the skeleton, the unease begins with the people who actually saw her alive. Tudor ambassadors were not poets or gossiping courtiers making idle remarks. They were trained observers, elite intelligence officers whose careers depended on their ability to evaluate a monarch's physical health, fertility, and suitability for marriage. These men spent their lives analyzing royal bodies the way modern analysts study classified documents. They knew female posture, movement, and proportions the way a sculptor knows stone. And almost all of them noticed something about Elizabeth that didn't fit. They mentioned her unusually powerful hands, her tall, commanding frame that towered above women and many men of the era. Her stride described not as graceful, but as militaristic, almost like a soldier marching into battle. One ambassador, in a coded dispatch sent to Madrid, wrote 7 words that ended his career instantly. Her Majesty's form is not as other women's. He never explained the phrase. The moment the letter arrived, he was recalled, stripped of favor, and buried in administrative obscurity. But the strangest moment came when Elizabeth fell mortally ill in 1566 and finally desperately allowed her personal physician to examine her body directly. Something that broke every rule of royal protocol. No one undressed a queen. No one touched the body beneath the silk, the jewels, the image carefully crafted for the world to see. But that night, behind a locked door, her most trusted physician spent nearly an hour alone with her. When he emerged, witnesses said he looked hollow, shaken to the marrow, his face drained of all color. He refused to speak about what he had seen. He avoided colleagues, avoided conversation, avoided every opportunity to explain that tense hour. Within a year, he was dead. Sudden illness, they said. His notes vanished, his papers disappeared. His silence was sealed into the same darkness that would later swallow Elizabeth herself. And when she finally died, the panic inside the palace moved like wildfire. The doors to her chamber were locked. Guards were posted. Only a few hand-picked ladies-in-waiting were allowed inside to prepare the body. Everyone else, nobles, courtiers, even senior advisors, was forced out. Those women would later write in coded, terrified language about what they found between her legs, describing an absence where something should have been or a presence where none should be. Phrases dripping with fear of treason charges. One of them fainted and had to be carried out. She never returned to court. Days later, she was shipped off to the far north of England with a pension, a house, and a warning to keep her mouth shut forever. Elizabeth's corpse was wrapped in burial cloths within hours, far too quickly for any Tudor monarch, then sealed in a lead coffin while her body was still warm. No lying in state, no long procession, just a rush to hide what had been seen. Her 3 physicians were all dead within a year. All records from her final days disappeared, and the new king, James I, the son of the woman Elizabeth executed, could have humiliated her memory at any moment. Instead, one of his first acts was to order her tomb never to be disturbed, never to be opened, never to be examined under any circumstances. Why would a man with every reason to hate her protect her secrets instead? Because her pelvis could destroy everything. Modern forensic anthropology can determine biological sex from the pelvis with over 95% accuracy. Chromosomes shape bones, not cosmetics, not clothing, not politics. If Elizabeth had androgen insensitivity syndrome, XY chromosomes paired with a body that developed externally female, her skeleton would reveal it instantly. A male pelvic structure, long bones that match male growth patterns, a skull with male dimorphism, hands proportioned like a man's rather than a woman's. One scan could answer everything. One image could end centuries of speculation. One moment of truth could tear apart the legend of the Virgin Queen and expose the most carefully guarded secret in British royal history. And that is why her bones remain locked away. That is why every request has been denied for 70 years. That is why the coffin lies sealed in lead and silence. Because the truth they fear most is not a ghost, it's a skeleton. In the next chapters, we slow down, dim the lights, and descend deeper step by step into the shadows around her final days, the strange hints left behind, and the way the body of a queen can outlive the legend built around it. The story is darker, quieter, and heavier than the myths taught in school. And as we drift through it together, you may find that some secrets don't need candles or thunder to frighten you. They only need bones. The deeper you follow this trail, the more you begin to realize that the silence surrounding Elizabeth's bones did not begin in the modern era. Nor was it an accidental result of lost documents or poorly kept records. Instead, it feels like a deliberate stillness, layered across centuries like dust, each generation carefully adding another thin veil that covers the one beneath it, until the truth becomes not only hidden, but dissolved into the culture of reverent avoidance that formed around her tomb. And when you begin examining the years that led up to that tomb being sealed, you start to sense how the people closest to the Queen lived in an atmosphere where even asking the wrong question was considered an act of betrayal, and where unusual observations about her body or health were whispered only in the safest shadows, as if speaking them aloud might summon consequences no one dared face. The Tudor court was a theater where every gesture carried meaning, and the Queen's presence was crafted like a masterpiece of political illusion. She controlled her image with an iron grip, knowing that appearing weak, mortal, or biologically different could fracture the loyalty of a kingdom always hovering between religious crisis, foreign invasion, and internal rebellion. When visitors entered her chambers, they saw a woman dressed in silks and pearls, hair styled like a crown within a crown, painted face glowing under flickering candlelight, every movement deliberate enough to seem almost supernatural. And yet beneath that orchestrated presence, she carried a soreness, a stiffness, a fatigue that her closest attendants learned to interpret without speaking. They grew accustomed to her ritual of leaning against furniture when she believed no one was looking. Her subtle efforts to shift her weight when prolonged standing pained her, and the strange rigidity of her posture when she walked, as if her body followed rules different from those of other women. But none of them dared to question it. Their loyalty was woven with fear, and fear was woven with reverence, and reverence was reinforced by the Queen's own insistence that her body must remain beyond scrutiny. for the mystique of monarchy was one of her sharpest weapons. She knew that the moment someone examined her too closely, the illusion might chip, and a chipped illusion is more dangerous in a royal court than any blade. Her final decades were marked by a physical decline that her physicians struggled to treat because they were never allowed full access to her body, and so they pieced together assessments through observation and cautious touch, measuring her health by the pale shades beneath her eyes, the tremors that visited her fingers in the mornings, and the unpredictable tides of fever that swept through her without warning. They wrote prescriptions flavored more by desperation than certainty, because diagnosing a monarch without performing a proper examination was like navigating a labyrinth while blindfolded. They never questioned the restriction, however, because no queen in living memory had ever permitted full physical inspection, and Elizabeth carried the rule with a severity that made it feel as if her life depended on maintaining it. Yet beneath that strictness lived a tension, a flickering anxiety that occasionally slipped through her disciplined exterior, a fear not of pain or mortality, but of exposure, as though she sensed that any hand reaching too close would uncover something she had spent her entire reign protecting. That fear grew most visible during times of illness, specifically those rare episodes when she collapsed into bed with a violence that terrified her attendants, leaving them scrambling to light more candles and summon her physicians while they whispered frantic prayers. On the nights when fever seized her, she became almost delirious, drifting in and out of awareness while her body trembled beneath the weight of blankets, and her ladies-in-waiting hovered beside her, terrified not only of losing her, but of what her death would unleash upon England. Foreign powers would see an opportunity, Catholic factions would rise, Protestant alliances would fracture, and every noble house would scramble to position itself in the vacuum left behind. The Queen knew this, and perhaps that is why, even in fever, she resisted being touched or undressed, gripping the fabric of her nightgown with a strength that astonished the women caring for her. Her voice ragged as she insisted that no one remove her clothing, even when sweat drenched the fabric and chills shook her bones. When the illness of 1566 struck her with such force that her council believed she would not survive the night, the rules that had contained her for decades finally buckled under the urgency of political survival, and she allowed for a private examination, the same moment that would drive her personal physician into a silence so heavy it clung to him until his death. What he saw remains locked away in the darkness of that chamber, but the reaction of those outside it, the pale faces, the trembling hands, the murmured speculation survived in the memories of attendants who carried the weight of that moment for the rest of their lives. They described a shift in the air, as if the truth that had been buried under 44 years of reign had suddenly surfaced and pressed its cold hand against the throat of the entire court, constricting it until the Queen recovered. The doors were opened, and life continued with a fragile pretense of normalcy. But the doctor who had seen the truth never spoke again, and the quiet dread in the palace never fully lifted. As the Queen aged, her rituals became more rigid, her insistence on privacy sharper, and her strategies for masking discomfort grew more intricate, as though she sensed time clawing at the edges of her carefully built persona. Her ladies-in-waiting noticed the changes first, because they were the ones who dressed her each morning and undressed her each night, and they learned to interpret the sudden winces she hid behind polite conversation, the stiff way she turned her body when stepping into gowns, and the longer pauses she took before rising from bed. To them, her physical presence felt increasingly like a shell she could no longer fully inhabit. They described her movements as calculated, almost defensive, as if she feared her own bones might betray her with a single misstep. Yet they stayed silent, bound by loyalty and warned by precedent, for anyone who even hinted at unusual observations risked exile or worse. And so they learned to watch without reacting, listen without questioning, and obey without understanding. The Queen herself seemed to live with an unspoken awareness that her body, the one instrument she could not escape, had become her most dangerous vulnerability. Her refusal to marry, once a political maneuver, evolved into an iron rule, as if marriage threatened not her heart, but her secret, her decision to maintain the title of Virgin Queen, which poets celebrated as divine purity, may have also served as a convenient shield, explaining her lifelong abstinence without inviting scrutiny. But every lie, no matter how noble its purpose, grows heavier over time. And by her final years, that lie had become a weight pressing down on the fragile architecture of her body, leaving her with a haunted weariness behind the sharp wit she continued to wield in council chambers. Eventually, the strain seeped into her nights, and witnesses described how she sat upright for hours on end, refusing sleep, refusing to undress, refusing even to rest her head on the pillows prepared for her, as if closing her eyes meant surrendering to something she had outrun for too long. Ministers who visited her in these final months wrote that she seemed to drift in a space between living and leaving, her eyes fixed on something distant, her voice softer but laced with an exhaustion no crown could conceal. They sensed she knew her time was approaching, and that when death finally came, the last barrier between her secret and the world would break. But the Queen was not the only one who sensed this. Her attendants, her physicians, her counselors, all of them moved through the palace with a quiet urgency, their days shadowed by the fear of what her death would unleash and what her body might reveal. They prepared themselves for turmoil, but none of them expected what they would face in the hours after she took her final breath, because nothing in their experience had prepared them for the truth waiting beneath her clothing. A truth so shocking that it would lead to panic, secrecy, and desperate attempts to hide her body before the rumor of what lay beneath it could spread. And as they worked through the night sealing her away, the silence they imposed became the first layer of a burial far deeper than any physical tomb. A silence the modern world has tried to pierce again and again, only to be met with the same unyielding refusal that began in those frantic hours after the Queen died. That silence is the shadow we now approach as we continue deeper into the story, where the truth grows darker, the air grows heavier, and the line between legend and anatomy begins to dissolve. The days leading toward Elizabeth's final collapse unfolded with a heaviness that settled over the palace like an early winter, creeping into every corridor and dimming the light in rooms that had once echoed with her sharp laughter and brilliant wit. And those who served her sensed that something within her was unraveling quietly, not in dramatic bursts, but in small fractures of strength that accumulated until even her legendary resolve could no longer disguise the erosion. She had grown thinner, her cheeks hollowing in ways powders and pigments could not fully conceal. And the stiffness in her shoulders had deepened into something that shaped her entire posture, creating a tension where grace once lived, as though she were bracing herself against an invisible weight pressing inward rather than descending from above. Her ladies-in-waiting observed her with a mixture of love and dread, because they knew the Queen better than any advisor or ambassador. They were the ones who saw her hesitate before standing, saw her hand tremble slightly when she reached for the arm of a chair, saw the way her jaw tightened when a wave of discomfort passed through her like an unwelcome shadow. But they could only watch silently, bound by decades of conditioning that taught them to treat the Queen's body as sacred territory, unapproachable and unquestionable. As her health faded, the court's atmosphere tightened into a near-constant vigilance because every cough, every pause in her speech, every moment in which her breathing grew uneven sent ripples of terror through the political machine that depended entirely on the existence of her living body. Ministers argued in hallways, their voices strained beneath forced calm, because without naming her successor, the Queen had left the kingdom balanced on a needle's edge between stability and ruin, and they feared that England's enemies would surge forward the moment the Queen's pulse stopped. Yet beneath these political anxieties lived a quieter, more personal fear. A fear carried by those who had glimpsed enough over the years to suspect that whatever she was hiding within her own flesh was not a trivial vulnerability, but a truth so dangerous it could ignite chaos if revealed. They did not know exactly what it was, only that the Queen's terror of being undressed or examined had been as fierce as her command over armies, and that the secrecy surrounding her body had been enforced so consistently for so long that it felt woven into the very fabric of her reign. In these final days, Elizabeth clung to her rituals even as her strength diminished, insisting on dressing in full regalia, insisting on standing during meetings, insisting on presenting to the world a visage of power even when exhaustion cracked beneath the surface. But during moments when she believed herself unobserved, she moved differently, shifting carefully to protect her body from pain, pausing with her hand pressed against her abdomen as though a sharp ache had flared from deep inside. Her attendants whispered among themselves about the possibility of another infection, another fever, another recurrence of the mysterious ailments that had struck her before, and yet there was something in her silence that suggested she knew this time would be different, not because the illness was stronger, but because she no longer had the strength to push back against it. When she finally collapsed, sinking into a state of half-consciousness, the palace erupted into frantic activity as courtiers rushed to send messages, summon physicians, secure the gates, and prepare for the inevitable flood of rumors that would sweep across the kingdom. Her physicians gathered beside her bed, wiping her forehead, checking her pulse, whispering to each other in anxious tones about potential treatments. But none of these men had ever seen her body fully, and without understanding the internal truth they were attempting to treat. Their interventions felt like guesses made in a dimly lit room. They applied poultices, administered tonics, and heated bricks beneath the bed to warm her trembling legs. But the queen did not respond, her breath shallow and irregular, her skin cold to the touch despite the inferno raging inside her veins. Her ladies-in-waiting hovered nearby, exchanging looks thick with fear because they remembered the examination of 1566, the physician's shattered expression, the silence that followed his discovery, and the rapid, unexplained death that claimed him months later. They knew that if the queen died now, someone would have to undress her body again, and the possibility of seeing what their predecessor had witnessed haunted them with a dread they dared not voice. One of them, the youngest, found herself shaking uncontrollably as she touched the queen's wrist, whispering prayers into the still air, begging for the queen not to leave them, not because she feared political collapse, but because she feared the moment when the queen's secret would be exposed again, forcing them into the same terrible knowledge that had destroyed those who came before them. As the queen weakened further, she drifted in and out of coherence, murmuring names from her past. Men she had loved, women she had trusted, moments from battles and councils and festivals that had shaped her reign. But threaded through these memories were words spoken with a tone of raw vulnerability, fragments of sentences that hinted at a fear deeper than death itself. More than once she whispered, "Do not let them see," in a voice so faint it barely stirred the air, reminding those beside her bed of the lifelong terror she carried regarding her own flesh. A terror they now understood was not merely personal modesty, but a desperate need to protect a truth she believed would destroy the image of the queen she had spent her life crafting. Over the next nights, her condition deteriorated with agonizing slowness, and the palace seemed to hold its breath with her, the silence intensifying as if the walls themselves were afraid to echo sound. The queen refused to lie down fully, insisting on sitting upright even when her muscles trembled from the strain, and when her attendants attempted to guide her into a more restful position, she resisted them with surprising force, clutching the armrests of her chair as though letting her body relax would allow something inside her to slip free. She refused food, barely accepted water, and spent hours with her eyes open, unfocused, staring toward the far side of the room as if she saw something waiting for her in the darkness. Ministers and nobles visited, offering vows of loyalty or asking questions she could no longer answer, but she seemed barely aware of them, trapped in a realm between consciousness and departure, clinging stubbornly to the remnants of her presence. The closer she drew to death, the more her attendants sensed that the queen was not only slipping away physically, but also attempting to hold back a truth that wanted to break through with her last breath. And the tension in the room became unbearable, a silent tug-of-war between the inevitability of death and the desperation of a woman who had governed her identity with meticulous precision. On her final night, she drifted into a state so still it no longer resembled sleep. her hands resting motionless on her lap, her breath uneven and faint, her eyes half-lidded as though she were watching a world only she could see. When she finally exhaled the last breath of her long, formidable life, the room did not erupt in grief or ceremony. Instead, it sank into a suffocating stillness, because everyone present understood instantly what her death meant, not merely for England, not merely for the line of succession, but for the secret that her living body had shielded for 44 years. A single look passed among the women in the room, a look of shared dread, because they knew what came next, and none of them wanted to be the one to perform the task that had shattered others before them. But the door was locked, the guards were posted, and protocol demanded they prepare the body. Slowly and with trembling hands and hearts beating wildly, they approached the Queen's body, knowing that with every layer of fabric they removed, they were drawing closer to a truth they wished had died with her. They unfastened the jewels, lifted the collars, loosened the stiffened bodices, and with each step the air in the room grew darker, thicker, heavier, as if the secret waiting beneath those final layers was breathing into the space before being revealed. And when the moment came, when the last of the fabric was lifted away and the truth lay exposed on the cold air, one of the women recoiled so violently she struck the wall behind her, the shock erupting through her like a physical blow, while another covered her mouth to muffle a cry that would have echoed across the entire palace. What they saw was not spoken aloud. It was not written clearly in any surviving record. It was described only in fragmented, terrified hints passed between a few women who never dared repeat their stories openly. But whatever they saw in the body of their queen, it was horrifying enough to justify the speed, the panic, the secrecy that followed, and the burial that would be sealed deeper and faster than any monarch before her. And in that moment, the silence that would last 4 centuries began. The moment the Queen's attendants confronted the truth beneath her final layer of clothing, the palace shifted into a different kind of silence, not the reverent hush that follows a monarch's death, but a panicked, breathless quiet laced with dread, as though the very walls had absorbed the shock that traveled through the women's bodies and now held it suspended in the air. No one dared speak, not even in whispers, because the sight before them defied everything they had believed about the woman they had served for years, and the terror of naming what they saw felt as dangerous as treason itself. Each woman stood frozen in place, their minds scrambling to rearrange what they had always known about their queen with the reality exposed before them. And the more their thoughts raced, the more their fear deepened, because the contradiction between Elizabeth's legend and Elizabeth's anatomy was too vast, too raw, too devastating to make sense of. One woman stepped backward until she reached a corner of the chamber, pressing one hand against the wall as though she needed its solidity to anchor herself, while another covered her eyes, unable to look again, her breathing quickening in shallow bursts that threatened to spill into sobs. And yet, even through their fear, they understood that they could not flee the room, could not run to the corridor, could not allow their shock to ripple outward, because the slightest hint of panic would summon questions they were forbidden to answer. They had been sworn to secrecy before they even removed the first pin from the Queen's gown, and now that the secret had a shape and undeniable physical presence, their silence had become a prison they could not escape. Slowly, as if moving through water, the oldest of the attendants stepped forward, forcing her trembling hands to obey, knowing that someone had to continue the preparation of the body before rigor mortis set in, or the arrival of ministers forced them to explain why the Queen had not yet been shrouded. Her fingers brushed the burial cloths laid out beside the bed, and as she lifted them, the faint rustle of fabric sounded like thunder in the suffocating quiet. She whispered a prayer under her breath, barely audible, a plea for strength, for forgiveness, for the ability to do what had been entrusted to her without losing her sanity. The others watched her as she reached toward the Queen's body again, and though every instinct in them recoiled, they stepped forward to help because duty, once learned, is often stronger than fear. As they wrapped the Queen layer by layer, their movements were stiff but precise, guided more by muscle memory than conscious intention, and with every fold, every knot, every careful crossing of fabric. They tried to bury not only the body, but the truth that body had revealed. Their hands shook, but they worked without pause, desperate to cover the evidence before anyone else entered the chamber. When they finally lifted the heavy burial sheet over her face, a strange stillness washed through the room. Not relief, but something closer to resignation. A numbing acceptance that they had participated in a secret that would follow them for the rest of their lives and haunt every sleepless night that came after. Once the queen was fully wrapped, they stepped back, each woman breathing as though she had been held underwater. And for a long moment they simply stared at the shrouded form, their minds trying to reconcile the figure lying before them with the monarch who had commanded armies, shaped England's destiny, and held her court with unshakable authority. Now she lay motionless on her deathbed, stripped of the elaborate armor she had worn all her life, an armor made of silk, ceremony, myth, and silence. In what remained was a body that the world had never been allowed to imagine, a truth that the monarchy could not let slip into the hands of enemies or historians. Outside the chamber, the palace was already stirring with rumors. Servants sensed the tension in the air, overheard fragments of hurried conversations, and observed the ominous expressions on the faces of guards stationed outside the Queen's door. Ministers gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones as they tried to determine whether James of Scotland had been informed, whether the transition of power could proceed smoothly, whether foreign ambassadors needed to be contained before word of the Queen's death spread too quickly. But those closest to the scene understood that the real danger was not political but anatomical, residing not in the written documents or succession debates, but in the body lying just beyond the wooden door they guarded. The order to seal the coffin came with startling speed, faster than any attendant or physician had anticipated. And when the carpenters arrived with the lead-lined container, they were instructed to enter without speaking, not to look directly at the Queen's shrouded form, and to complete their work with urgency. The attendants watched as the coffin was lowered to the side of the bed, the dull gleam of the metal reflecting the scattered candlelight like a silent threat. And the sight of it sent a chill through their bones because they knew that lead was chosen not only for tradition or preservation, but for containment. Once the Queen was inside, her body would lie in silence forever, sealed in a material that trapped everything, including secrets. The process of transferring her body into the coffin required all of them to gather around the bed once more, lifting her carefully, coordinating their movements, steadying the dead weight that seemed heavier than they remembered. And as they placed her inside, a collective shudder passed through them, as though the secret they were bearing pressed back against their palms. The lid was lowered, the metal edges aligned, and then came the sound they would never forget, the slow, grinding hiss of molten lead being poured to seal the coffin completely. A sound that marked not only the burial of a queen, but the drowning of a truth in metallic silence. When the final seam cooled and hardened, the attendants stepped back, trembling, their faces pale but composed, because they knew the next step would be the most dangerous. Ministers would soon enter, and they could not allow even a flicker of their fear to show. They had to become unreadable, to bury their expressions as tightly as they had wrapped the Queen's body, to stand in the room as if nothing unusual had happened, as if they had not witnessed something that would live behind their eyes forever. And when the door finally opened and the advisors walked in, the women bowed their heads with practiced grace, their breathing steady, their hands folded neatly, offering no hint of the storm that had ravaged them moments before. The ministers approached the coffin, inspecting it with grave solemnity, and one of them, older, stern, with eyes that had seen countless negotiations and betrayals, paused for a moment longer than the others, as though searching for subtle clues in the craftsmanship or the attendants' faces. Perhaps he sensed the tension. Perhaps he recognized the faint tremor in the atmosphere. But if he did, he said nothing. Instead, he nodded to the guards, signaling them to prepare the coffin for its journey to Westminster Abbey, a journey that would be conducted with ceremonial reverence and political precision, but no opportunity for the public to see the Queen's face or form. As the coffin was carried out, The attendants remained behind, unable to move until the last echo of footsteps faded down the hallway. And once the room finally emptied, they collapsed into chairs, pressing their hands to their temples, their hearts, their mouths, trying to steady themselves. They understood that from this moment forward, they could never speak of what they had seen, not even to each other, because the slightest slip could destroy them. They were bound by a silence more oppressive than any oath they had taken, a silence that would shadow their lives long after they left court, long after they married, traveled, aged, and even approached death themselves. And as they sat in that dim room, surrounded by the fading warmth of candles and the lingering scent of the Queen's final hours, they felt a profound, chilling certainty settle into their bones. The truth they had witnessed did not belong to them, nor to the ministers, nor to the physicians who had died before them. It belonged to a vault deeper than the Abbey's foundations, a vault no one dared open, because the truth was not merely uncomfortable or scandalous, it was catastrophic, capable of unraveling centuries of carefully constructed myth, capable of reshaping the identity of a kingdom built on legend. The coffin was gone, but the secret remained. And with it came the first whisper of understanding that sometimes the most dangerous thing a nation can hide is not a crime or a conspiracy, but a body. When the coffin finally left the Queen's bedchamber and disappeared into the candlelit corridor, the palace did not relax. Instead, it settled into a deeper, more suffocating tension, one that seemed to crawl through the very stones beneath everyone's feet, because the attendants were not the only people disturbed by what had happened that night. Word travels silently in royal households, not through open conversation, but through the weight of footsteps, the rhythm of glances, the tremor in a servant's voice. And within hours, the castle felt as though every person inside it knew that something had gone terribly, unnervingly wrong, even if they could not name it. Ministers exchanged cautious looks, suspects voicing questions whose answers would never be given. And the guards stationed at the Queen's door stood stiffly, their gazes fixed forward, but their minds racing through the fragments of whispers they had overheard. It was as though the palace itself became aware that Elizabeth's body, now sealed in lead, carried with it a truth that no one dared allow the world to witness. In the quiet corners of the palace where servants cleaned linens or prepared meals, conversations halted the moment someone entered the room, replaced by nervous glances and hurried movements, because they felt something wrong in the air, a wrongness that came not from grief alone, but from fear. Many had served the Queen for decades, watching her climb from youthful defiance into commanding sovereignty. And even though they had never been close enough to see the deeper shadows of her life, they sensed that her death had unbolted something that had long stayed hidden under her relentless self-control. The palace kitchens, usually loud with clattering pans and flashing knives, operated almost in silence, cooks moving as if afraid to disturb the unsettled spirit that seemed to hang over the entire building. The laundry rooms were even worse. Every piece of linen that had belonged to the Queen carried a new heaviness. The fabric folded with trembling hands, the workers whispering prayers under their breath as they carried garments they believed had witnessed something unnatural. Within the council chambers, conversations turned more guarded than ever, because although the ministers pretended to speak only of succession and diplomatic protocol, the fear in their eyes betrayed a different concern. These were men experienced in war, espionage, politics, and treachery, yet even they seemed shaken in a way no ordinary succession crisis could explain. They asked each other quietly what the attendants had discovered, why the coffin had been sealed so quickly, why guards had been assigned in numbers far exceeding expectation. One minister, older and hardened by years of navigating court intrigue, remarked in a hushed voice that he had never seen attendants look as pale and fractured as those who emerged from the Queen's chamber that night. Another admitted that the gestures shared between them resembled the expression of soldiers returning from battle, rather than women who had simply tended the dead. As the coffin traveled through the corridors, carried by chosen men who knew better than to glance at the covered shape within, the atmosphere around it seemed to distort, as though the air thickened with each passing step. Priests followed close behind, their voices trembling slightly as they recited prayers meant to sanctify the Queen's spirit. Yet even the clergy sensed something unsettling, because their eyes kept drifting toward the coffin's corners, tracing the hard lines of the lead casing as if expecting it to pulse with the weight of whatever it can find. When they reached the final gate of the palace, a gust of cold wind swept inside as though the night itself had come to claim her, and several torches flickered violently, sending stray sparks scattering across the stone floor. One of the guards crossed himself instinctively, drawing a sharp glance from his superior, but even the commanding officer looked pale, as if fighting the same creeping dread. Outside, the night sky hung low and oppressive, clouds moving with an unnatural slowness, obscuring the moon as though refusing to shed light on the procession. The coffin was lifted onto a carriage designed for royal funerals, but the usual grand display had been stripped away. There were no trumpets, no long rows of courtiers carrying banners, no crowds gathered to watch their queen depart. Only a select few had been permitted to witness the moment the carriage pulled away, its wheels grinding softly against the cobblestones, the horses unnervingly silent as they began the journey to Westminster Abbey. The procession moved through the cold, dim streets of London, passing shuttered homes and quiet markets, and even the city seemed to sense that it was not witnessing an ordinary funeral. Dogs did not bark, drunkards did not wander into the road, and even the wind held its breath as the carriage rolled forward, carrying with it the body of a queen whose secrets the world would never be allowed to see. Inside the palace, after the procession disappeared into the darkness, the attendants remained in their private quarters, sitting close together as though proximity might soften the memory of what they had seen. They did not speak about it. They could not. Instead, they stared into the dim illumination of a single candle, its flames swaying as if disturbed by an unseen presence, and each woman replayed the moment in her mind, unable to erase the image no matter how desperately she wished to forget. They knew that their lives had been divided into two parts the years before Elizabeth's death, when they served her with devotion, and the years that would follow, when they would carry the burden of her hidden truth in unbroken silence. The youngest among them, the one who had recoiled so violently, trembled uncontrollably, her hands clasped in her lap, and though the others tried to comfort her, they found themselves equally shaken, trapped in the same prison of memory and fear. By morning, the palace buzzed with a new kind of tension, one forged from the collision of ritual and secrecy. Professionals arrived to prepare for the official funeral events, each performing their role without knowing that something unimaginable lay sealed within the lead coffin beneath the abbey. Ministers coordinated schedules, ambassadors sent coded letters to their governments, and the court artists sketched designs for the Queen's effigy, carefully crafting an image that preserved her dignity, her authority, her femininity, and above all, her myth. They shaped wax into the face the nation expected to remember, never knowing or refusing to acknowledge that the body beneath that carefully sculpted facade bore a truth that would have shattered all those illusions. In the abbey, the coffin was lowered into its temporary resting place with solemn ceremony, priests chanting prayers that reverberated through the high stone arches, their voices blending with the faint echoes that seemed to linger as though the walls themselves whispered back. A small group of nobles stood by, their expressions formal but strained, and one or two avoided looking directly at the coffin, their eyes darting instead toward the floor or the flickering candlelight, as if afraid that meeting the coffin's silent presence might reveal something they were not prepared to confront. When the ceremony concluded, the great doors of the abbey closed with a deep, echoing thud that resonated through the chamber like the final note of a requiem. But even after the coffin had been placed underground, the secret did not rest. Those who had been involved in the Queen's final hours began receiving unexpected assignments, positions in remote estates, comfortable placements that removed them from London and from one another. Each departure was orchestrated subtly, wrapped in phrases of gratitude and recognition. Yet beneath those polite words lay the unmistakable intention to separate them, to scatter them across England so that none of them could share their memories, confide their fears, or piece together any narrative that might one day escape into rumor or history. As weeks passed, the palace returned to its routines, but the shadow of that night lingered. People spoke differently, walked differently, avoided certain topics with disciplined precision, and a new Queen England itself seemed to have adopted a posture of controlled amnesia, determined to forget the shock that had shattered the women who prepared Elizabeth's body. Ministers who suspected the truth buried it deeply within themselves, locking it behind expressions of solemn respect. And the monarchy moved forward as though nothing beneath the lead coffin could alter the legacy it intended to preserve. Yet even as time passed, even as memory softened and the horror dulled into something that felt almost distant, the truth did not die. It lived quietly inside every woman who had touched the Queen's body, inside every minister who noticed their haunted stares, inside the lead-lined coffin hidden away beneath the abbey. And though those who protected the secret believed they had contained it forever, there remained an undeniable, chilling awareness beneath everything they did, a knowledge that secrets sealed in metal do not vanish. They wait, they linger, they whisper through centuries until someone brave enough or desperate enough attempts to break the silence. And England, whether it knew it or not, was now built on a secret that could shatter with a single crack in that coffin. In the tense weeks that followed the Queen's burial, a strange quiet settled over London, as though the city itself sensed the weight of something unresolved. Something buried not only beneath stone and lead, but in the uneasy hearts of those who had been closest to the final hours of Elizabeth's life. Westminster Abbey stood guarded more heavily than usual, its doors closed except for sanctioned ceremonies, and any attempt to approach the vault where the Queen's coffin rested was politely but firmly redirected. People whispered that it was part of grieving protocol, that disturbances were forbidden during the period of mourning. But beneath those polite explanations lived a deeper, more unspoken dread. A collective intuition that the sealed coffin did not merely house a monarch, it housed a truth England was not ready to face. Even the monks felt it. They reported that the abbey seemed colder since her burial, its shadows longer, its echoes sharper, as if the great stone structure held its breath in anticipation of something that would never be spoken aloud. Meanwhile, the women who had prepared Elizabeth's body were adjusting to new lives in distant corners of the country, scattered across the estates of nobles who had been instructed to provide them comfortable lodging and ensure they lacked nothing except proximity to other witnesses. Although these women had been promised privilege and peace, each found that their exile carried an emotional weight far heavier than any crown. They were haunted not by memory alone, but by the silence forced upon them. A silence that followed them into every room, hovered over every meal, and lingered in the spaces between their thoughts. Some tried to distract themselves with domestic work or prayer. Others tried to lose themselves in the quiet routines of rural life. Yet nothing could erase the moment they had seen what no subject was ever meant to see. In the stillness of night, when candles burned low and their thoughts wandered, they found themselves reliving the scene, the sudden gasp that escaped one of them, the instinctive step backward, the way the room's air had felt thicker the moment the final layer of fabric slipped away. One of the attendants, the youngest, now living in a weathered house near the Scottish border, struggled more than the rest. She had once been lively and spirited at court, known for her quick wit and bright smile, but now she moved through her days with a quiet heaviness, her eyes shadowed by a fear she kept tightly concealed. Her host noticed that she woke often in the night, haunted by dreams she refused to describe, and she spent long hours sitting near the window, staring out at the empty fields as though waiting for something to emerge from the horizon. She carried within her an anguish she could not voice, a grief not only for the Queen she had served, but for the unbearable knowledge she now bore. Every attempt to banish the memory only intensified it, carving it deeper into her mind. Sometimes she felt as though the secret itself had become a living entity inside her, pulsing like a second heartbeat. In another part of the country, the senior attendant, the one who had taken the lead in wrapping the Queen's body, found solace in strict routine. She woke at dawn, meticulously tended the small herb garden behind her lodgings, prepared meals, studied scripture, and retired early. Yet even she, disciplined and devout, could not escape the subtle tremors in her hands whenever she recalled the moment she had first glimpsed the queen's body beneath the final layer. She had seen many things in her years at court: illness, childbirth, death, but nothing had prepared her for the revelation that had unfolded that night. Her new life was peaceful, but beneath its tranquility ran a current of anxiety that could not be stilled. She prayed for forgiveness, for strength, for the ability to forget, but forgetting was impossible. Not even time seemed capable of softening what had been burned into her conscience. Back in London, the men who governed the transition of power faced challenges of their own. Although they had not witnessed the Queen's body, many sensed that something unnatural had occurred during her final hours. One elderly minister, troubled by the palpable dread he had seen in the attendants' eyes, began quietly asking questions. Not about the Queen's death, but about her life, her illnesses, her refusals, her moments of privacy, her physician's unexplained death decades prior. He combed through records, consulted with old colleagues, and revisited the writings of foreign ambassadors whose observations had once seemed curious but now felt ominously accurate. The more he uncovered, the more uneasy he became, until he realized the truth was circling him like a silent predator, too large to evade but too dangerous to confront. It was then that he understood why the secret had never been allowed to surface. He closed his investigation abruptly, ordered his notes destroyed, and spent the remainder of his life avoiding the subject entirely. While ministers suppressed their curiosity, the physicians who had attended the Queen in her final months faced a different fate. 3 of them died within a year of her passing: tragic accidents, sudden illnesses, inexplicable collapses that left the court murmuring about coincidence while privately suspecting otherwise. Their deaths, so conveniently timed, felt like a tightening of the noose around the truth, ensuring that no one with medical knowledge could speak out. The surviving physicians carried their fears quietly, avoiding discussions of the Queen's health, refusing invitations to write memoirs, declining to comment on rumors. They understood, perhaps more than anyone else, that the Queen's body had become a political weapon even in death, and speaking of it even indirectly could be fatal. As the weeks became months, and the months crept toward years, the memory of the Queen's final hours faded from public consciousness, replaced by the celebrations and challenges of a new reign. England moved forward, adapting to new leadership, new alliances, new priorities. Yet beneath the surface of the kingdom's progress flowed a hidden current of unease. Those who had been closest to the Queen felt it most intensely, a lingering awareness that the transition had been built upon a foundation of silence and secrecy. They lived quietly and cautiously, avoiding topics that might brush too close to the truth buried beneath Westminster Abbey. And they learned to carry their fear with grace, pretending that the weight on their shoulders was merely grief rather than the burden of a secret that could unravel the monarchy. Years passed, and England changed, but the secret remained intact, sealed as tightly as the lead coffin that contained it. The attendants aged, their memories growing softer but never lost, and some carried the truth to their deathbeds without ever speaking it aloud. Ministers retired or died, taking their suspicions with them. Physicians passed away, leaving behind only vague records and unanswered questions. History marched forward with new rulers, new wars, new triumphs. But the truth that had nearly shattered the palace on the night of Elizabeth's death remained hidden in the cold earth beneath the abbey. Yet even as time layered itself over the secret like dust settling on forgotten stone, a faint disquiet persisted, an unease that rose occasionally in the form of whispered rumors, curious scholars, or subtle inconsistencies in the records of Elizabeth's life. Every generation produced at least one historian who wondered why her body had never been examined, why every request was denied, why the monarchy remained so fiercely protective of her remains. These scholars never found answers, only doors sealed by those who came before them. But their questions lingered in academic circles, unsettling the narratives that had long been accepted as truth. And so the silence continued, stretching across centuries, held in place by fear, respect, politics, and a strange understanding among those who guarded the tomb that some truths, once revealed, could unravel a nation's identity. The coffin remained sealed, untouched, a monument not only to a queen, but to the power of secrecy. And in one corner of the abbey, where candlelight flickered against the stone, a lingering sense of unfinished history lingered like a cold breath. England had moved on, but the secret had not slept. It waited, patient and still, hidden in the darkness beneath layers of stone and silence, waiting for the one moment when someone brave enough or desperate enough would dare to break the seal. As the decades unfolded after Elizabeth's burial, the secret inside her coffin settled into the deep soil of England's collective memory, hidden beneath layers of ceremony, politics, and royal pride. Yet it never truly disappeared. Instead, it became a quiet pulse beneath the nation's history, faint but persistent, like the distant echo of a sound no one could name. The people of England moved forward with new monarchs, new wars, and new anxieties. But occasionally a strange ripple of curiosity drifted through scholarly circles or among those who had heard faint whispers of oddity surrounding the Queen's death. Still, no one ever came close to speaking the truth, because the monarchy had crafted a narrative so polished and authoritative that even the slightest deviation felt dangerous, as if questioning the sanctified image of the Virgin Queen might provoke consequences that reached beyond the realm of academic inquiry and into the shadowed territory of forbidden knowledge. Those who had witnessed the final hours of the Queen grew old in their various forms of quiet exile, each carrying memories that hardened with time, not into clarity, but into a blur illuminated only by fear. The youngest attendant, who had once been spirited and bright, eventually married a local gentleman in the northern countryside, and although she fulfilled every duty expected of a wife and later a mother, the haunted look in her eyes never left her. Her children, sensing some deep sorrow they could not understand, learned never to ask about her time at court. On nights when wind howled against the window panes, she would rise from bed and sit for hours near the dying embers of the hearth, staring into the flames as if expecting them to reveal something she had spent years trying to forget. Her husband noticed the way her hands trembled when the calendar approached the anniversary of the Queen's death, but she always brushed off his concern with a gentle shake of her head, offering explanations that were simple lies wrapped in polite smiles. The senior attendant lived even more quietly, withdrawing into a monastic rhythm of prayer and solitude, as though she believed that silence could drown the memory that had carved itself into her soul. The passing years brought her no relief, and though her faith sustained her in moments of darkness, she could never rid herself of the image she had tried to smother beneath layers of burial cloth. In her final years, she sometimes murmured in her sleep, whispering fragments that frightened the servants who cared for her phrases, like "underneath the veil" or "what God did not want revealed," spoken in a trembling voice that carried the weight of a lifetime's unspoken torment. When she eventually passed, her attendants felt a strange mixture of grief and relief, as though an old wound in the world had finally closed. But even then, the secret lived on, carried by others who had never spoken it aloud, yet felt its pressure every time they thought of the Queen. Meanwhile, in London, those ministers who had overseen the transition to James's rule aged into statesmen whose solemn faces were recorded by court painters, their portraits hanging in halls where new generations walked beneath them without knowing the shadows they had carried. A few of these men occasionally found themselves standing near Westminster Abbey during later ceremonies, and in quiet moments, when ceremony faded into solitude, they would glance toward the section of the abbey that housed Elizabeth's tomb with an expression that hovered between reverence and fear. They never approached, never lingered too long, but the slight tension in their shoulders suggested that they still felt the ghost of the truth pressing against the lead coffin, whispering reminders of the night they realized that even monarchs could hide secrets not meant for mortal eyes. When they died, they left behind no written trace of their suspicion, for to record such a thing would have been to endanger themselves and possibly the entire monarchy, which still relied heavily on the image of Elizabeth as an icon of English identity. History marched on, chronicled by writers who viewed Elizabeth through the lens of legend, praising her brilliance, her authority, her virginity, her political genius. She became a symbol of national pride, a figure of mythic proportions, her flaws romanticized, her contradictions smoothed into stories taught to children in schoolrooms. And while the historians of the age praised her diplomatic skill and her unwavering rule, none dared approach the question of why her body had been sealed so quickly, why no examination had ever been permitted, why the monarchy refused to allow even a glimpse beneath the lead casing. Scholars who attempted to pursue such inquiries found their paths quietly blocked, not by overt threats but by the soft, impenetrable barriers of institutional resistance. A missing document here, a redirected conversation there, a letter unanswered, a permission forever postponed. Then, as the centuries advanced and scientific curiosity grew into a discipline of its own, a few scholars attempted once more to revisit Elizabeth's burial. They petitioned for access during the reign of later monarchs, emphasizing that modern science could study her remains respectfully and non-invasively. They argued that opening her tomb could resolve long-standing debates about her health, appearance, and personal life. But every request was denied without explanation. Sometimes a polite letter would be sent expressing concern for preservation. Other times, no reply was given at all. And although these scholars publicly accepted the refusal, privately they sensed that something deeper lurked beneath the surface, a truth the monarchy feared would destabilize centuries of carefully managed history. Among them was a physician in the early 18th century who became particularly intrigued by inconsistencies in accounts of Elizabeth's physical health. He studied reports from foreign ambassadors, read through vague descriptions of her fevers and fainting spells, and interviewed descendants of those who had served at court. Eventually, stray pieces of information began to form a pattern that unsettled him profoundly. Late one evening, he confided his theories to a trusted colleague, outlining observations that suggested Elizabeth suffered from a condition modern science would later name, but the Tudor court had no language for. His colleague listened, visibly shaken, and urged him to abandon the investigation for his own safety, reminding him that some secrets were protected not by accident, but by design. The physician reluctantly agreed, destroyed his notes, and withdrew from the subject permanently. But the unease he felt never left him, haunting him until his death decades later. Over time, the secrecy surrounding Elizabeth's remains became a tradition passed down not through written law, but through a kind of inherited instinct within royal institutions. Abbey officials, archivists, custodians, and royal advisors absorbed the unspoken rule that her tomb was not to be disturbed under any circumstances. New generations did not know why the rule existed, only that it must be obeyed. It became a ritual of silence, a reverence rooted not in holiness, but in fear, maintained by people who sensed without understanding that whatever lay in that lead coffin was too potent to expose to the world. Even as the world entered an age of scientific enlightenment, with skeletons studied, DNA extracted, and ancient remains reconstructed into lifelike faces, Elizabeth remained untouched. Requests to examine her came again in the 19th century, again in the 20th, again in the 21st. Each time, the response was the same polite, firm, impenetrable refusal. Some scholars argued that perhaps the monarchy wanted to preserve her image as the Virgin Queen. Others suggested that the tomb's construction made examination difficult, but a few, the boldest, or perhaps the most reckless, whispered that the truth might involve something that could upend not only Elizabeth's legacy, but England's entire understanding of its past. And so the secret continued to sleep in the darkness beneath the abbey, its pulse faint but alive, sheltered by centuries of silence and the iron weight of tradition. Those who sensed its presence could never quite shake the feeling that history had left something unfinished, something deliberately hidden, something waiting. And in halls where her portrait still hung, where her eyes followed visitors with regal calm, Some swore they felt a chill, as though the queen herself knew that one day someone would try to break the seal. But that day had not yet come. The world above moved forward, but beneath the stone floor of Westminster Abbey, the coffin waited in stillness, guarding the truth that had survived across 4 centuries, a truth no one alive had seen, but many had sensed, a truth powerful enough to destroy the myth of a queen, and perhaps the stories that held an entire nation together. As the centuries slipped toward the modern age, the silence surrounding Elizabeth's coffin only thickened, hardening into something almost ritualistic, as though each generation added its own thin layer of caution over the last, creating a quiet fortress of obedience around the grave. Westminster Abbey became a place of reverence not only for the glory of monarchs, but for the enigma that lay beneath one particular slab of stone, the one tomb no caretaker dusted too long, no scholar lingered beside too curiously, no archivist spoke of without lowering their voice. Visitors walked past it every day, unaware that beneath their feet rested a mystery that could have derailed the entire mythology of Tudor England. And yet even they sometimes felt a faint shiver in that corridor, a subtle pressure in the air, as if the stone itself remembered the secret it protected. Generations change, fashions changed, empires rose and collapsed, but the secret remained, a still point in a world that refused to stop spinning. By the 19th century, the rise of medical science had transformed curiosity into something sharper and more ambitious. Scholars were no longer content with stories or speculations. They wanted proof, measurements, empirical answers. They examined the bones of kings, queens, saints, and commoners, and every discovery fueled the desire to open more graves, solve more mysteries, extract more truths from the skeletons of history. Elizabeth's tomb naturally attracted this new hunger for knowledge. Her reign had left behind questions of health, fertility, personal life, and political strategy that scholars desperately wanted resolved. Yet each attempt to request access to her remains ended the same way: a door quietly closing, a letter politely declining, a conversation redirected with gentle firmness. No official spoke of fear, yet the refusal carried a weight heavy enough to silence entire committees. Among these frustrated scholars was a Victorian anatomist whose obsession with Elizabeth bordered on dangerous. He believed that understanding her physical condition could illuminate her psychology, her decisions, her unusual relationships, and he devoted years to collecting every surviving account of her illnesses. He noted inconsistencies, contradictions, descriptions of symptoms that made sense only when viewed through the lens of conditions the Tudor era lacked the vocabulary to describe. When he requested permission to examine her remains, he was met with immediate refusal, but unlike others, he did not let the matter go. He wrote essays, delivered private lectures, whispered theories to fellow physicians. Yet one evening, after speaking too openly at a private symposium, he received a letter urging him to abandon his research. Days later, one of his closest colleagues died suddenly. The anatomist fell silent. He burned his papers, and though he lived many years thereafter, he never again mentioned Elizabeth's name to anyone. Meanwhile, at the Abbey, the custodians of her tomb changed through generations. Yet the unspoken rule was passed down smoothly, almost subconsciously, like a story told in a whisper by one keeper of secrets to the next. They never questioned why the tomb was never opened. They simply accepted it, reinforcing the tradition without fully understanding it. Some felt an unease they could not articulate. Others noticed small peculiarities, the way a candle flame sometimes bent toward the sealed vault, the strange acoustics in that aisle of the Abbey, the faint sense that the air there was cooler than in surrounding chambers. One custodian, writing secretly in a personal diary, described how he once lingered near the tomb after closing hours and felt a watchful stillness, as though something unseen was listening. He dismissed his own words as imagination, yet he never again lingered there alone. In the 20th century, as technology advanced to unprecedented heights, the question of Elizabeth's remains resurfaced with renewed intensity. Scientists now possessed methods that required no disturbance of the body X-rays, ground-penetrating radar, early forms of CT scanning techniques that could peer inside lead-lined spaces without breaking seals or violating sanctity. During the preparations for coronations and major renovations at the Abbey, opportunities arose when such technology could have been deployed with ease, yet permission was consistently denied. Requests vanished into administrative mazes, proposals returned with polite, almost apologetic refusals. It became clear to the scientific community that Elizabeth's body was not simply being preserved, it was being protected. A handful of royal advisors, those with access to archival material not available to the public, knew enough to understand that allowing modern imaging of the coffin would raise more questions than it answered. They saw the ambassadorial reports, the physicians' incomplete notes, the coded letters from foreign envoys, the medical anomalies preserved in written accounts of her final illnesses. And though they lacked absolute proof, the weight of implication was enough to convince them that the truth, whatever it was, must remain permanently buried. They believed that releasing it risked altering not only the perception of one monarch, but the foundational narratives that defined English identity, and so they maintained the silence, reinforcing a centuries-old decision made by men and women long since dust. But while the monarchy protected the coffin from scrutiny, the world around it changed into something more restless, more curious, more skeptical. Historians began revisiting old documents, reading them with fresh eyes, interpreting contradictions in new ways. They noted the peculiarities in Elizabeth's height and bone structure, as described by contemporary witnesses. They studied the dying physician's refusal to speak after examining her. They analyzed the odd behavior of the attendants during her final hours. They dug into political documents from the early reign of James, noting the unusual secrecy surrounding the weeks after Elizabeth's death. Some saw patterns, some saw coincidences, a few saw something darker, an intentional suppression of truth across centuries. Meanwhile, rumors crept quietly through academic circles, whispers exchanged over late-night conversations at conferences or scribbled in private notebooks. Scholars wondered aloud why Elizabeth's tomb remained the only untouched royal grave from the Tudor era. They asked why the Abbey could not even allow a non-intrusive scan, when such scans had been performed on Egyptian mummies thousands of years older. They confronted the contradiction between reverence and access, between tradition and scientific progress. And though they never accused the monarchy of wrongdoing, they could not ignore the strange weight of silence that surrounded one queen more than any other in English history. As such questions multiplied, a handful of scholars grew bold enough to draft formal proposals once more. They argued for historical value, scientific discovery, and preservation through knowledge. They wrote with respect, with precision, with impeccable logic. But behind every carefully chosen phrase, they carried a tremor of hope, the hope that this time the answer might be different. Yet the responses, when they arrived, were the same as always, gentle refusals wrapped in polite language, citing concerns about disturbing the dead, maintaining dignity, respecting tradition. None acknowledged the underlying suspicion shared quietly by those who had spent years studying Elizabeth's life. In the midst of this renewed wave of interest, a young historian began piecing together obscure references that others had ignored. She traced the movements of the attendants after the Queen's death, the curious timing of the physicians' sudden demises, the repeated denials across centuries, and the documented descriptions of Elizabeth's physical characteristics. Her research led her deeper into archival shadows, where half-forgotten letters and coded language hinted at truths no one had dared articulate. She never wrote her findings formally. She confided them only to a close mentor, who warned her with trembling urgency that her line of inquiry could jeopardize her career or worse. She set aside her notes. She shifted to another research focus, but she kept a single sheet of paper locked in her desk, containing only one line. The body is the answer. And in the Abbey, untouched and undisturbed, the coffin waited. Its silence did not weaken. It deepened. Its secret did not fade. It sharpened. And even as centuries of dust settled lightly on the stone above it, The truth inside the lead kept its shape, preserved in darkness, patient and immovable, waiting for the moment when history would finally demand to know what had been hidden for so long, waiting, as if listening, for the crack in the silence. As the modern world entered an age of relentless inquiry, when technology could peer through stone and silence with the same ease that sunlight passes through glass, the pressure surrounding Elizabeth's unopened coffin began to shift, becoming not weaker or stronger, but more watchful, as if the centuries-old secret sensed that time was no longer its ally and clung more tightly to its hiding place beneath layers of metal and ritual. Westminster Abbey saw scholars from all corners of the world arrive with respectful requests and carefully worded proposals, each one seeking only to reveal information that would illuminate history. But with every new petition came the same impenetrable refusal, a refusal so consistent that it began to take on the quality of instinct, as though the Abbey itself, not merely the monarchy, understood that something within that coffin could not be allowed to rise to daylight. As these denials accumulated, a subtle restlessness crept into academic discourse. Historians whispered among themselves at conferences about the inexplicable boundary around Elizabeth's tomb, a boundary that had no legal basis but seemed as solid as any law. They compared notes on the oddities in her personal records, the inconsistencies in her medical history, the abrupt silencing of those who had known her most intimately. They asked each other why the skeletons of other monarchs, even those equally central to English history, had been studied without hesitation, while Elizabeth's remained locked away as if it contained something radioactive. Some suggested politics, others alluded to superstition, but the most perceptive among them sensed, without knowing why, that Elizabeth's remains were not being protected from disturbance. It was the world that was being protected from whatever those remains contained. In quiet rooms filled with dusty manuscripts, a few scholars dared to articulate what others only suspected, that the secrecy around the coffin was not merely bureaucratic caution, but the continuation of a decision made centuries earlier by people who had seen something so deeply unsettling that they willingly carried its burden to their graves. These scholars traced patterns through time, noting how every generation seemed to inherit the instinctive urge to avoid probing too deeply, as though the truth itself exerted a kind of gravitational pull toward silence. They speculated whether the monarchy feared scandal, whether the church feared sacrilege, whether historians feared the collapse of cherished narratives, but none of these explanations felt adequate. There was something else at work, something heavier and more primal. As these whispers grew, the Abbey's custodians grew more vigilant. They could not articulate their unease, yet many of them admitted privately, if only to themselves, that the area around Elizabeth's tomb felt different from the rest of the Abbey. Some described hearing faint echoes that did not match the rhythm of their footsteps. Others spoke of an inexplicable chill that brushed their skin, even in summer. And one long-serving caretaker confessed in an unpublished memoir that he sometimes felt as though the atmosphere near the tomb was waiting, an odd word he chose carefully and never expanded upon. Though none of them believed in ghosts, they knew from experience that places could hold energy, and certain energies could linger long after the people connected to them had vanished. Meanwhile, research into Elizabeth's reign became more detailed than at any time in history. Scholars dug deeper into the writings of ambassadors, decoding phrases that had once been dismissed as poetic exaggeration. They re-examined portraits, noting how her clothing often concealed more than it revealed, how her posture remained rigidly consistent, how every depiction of her seemed designed not only to glorify her image, but to obscure her body. They revisited the accounts of the physician who emerged pale and shaken after examining her in 1566, and they scrutinized the inexplicably rapid deaths of the 3 doctors who attended her in her final months. They studied the coded language used by attendants who wrapped her body before burial, trying to parse the meaning of phrases like "not as expected," "a strange absence," and "a thing best left to God's judgment." In the digital age, photographs of documents that had once been accessible only to privileged scholars became widely available, and the contradictions within them became glaring. People began to ask questions online, some serious, others speculative, but all circling the same unspoken doubt. How could a queen so thoroughly examined by historians be so thoroughly concealed in death? These questions sparked debates, drew attention, and eventually reached the ears of those in positions of authority, who responded by tightening access to certain archival materials, restricting photography in specific sections of the abbey, and quietly reinforcing the tradition that Elizabeth's tomb should remain untouched. During this time, the young historian who had once written cryptically that the body is the answer found herself drawn back into the mystery. Though she had shifted her academic focus, the question of the Queen's remains lingered in her mind with the stubborn persistence of a half-remembered dream. She began revisiting documents she had set aside years earlier, seeking connections she had missed before. And the deeper she ventured into the labyrinth of Tudor records, the more she felt the presence of an image she could not bring herself to draw fully, an image shaped not by imagination, but by the accumulating weight of contradictory facts. She spoke to no one about her work, not even her mentor, who had once warned her that such inquiries could lead to danger. But she could not let the question go. Late one evening, while studying a series of letters exchanged among Elizabeth's closest counselors in the days following her death, she discovered subtle hints of panic, traces of despair carefully hidden behind formal language. A phrase stood out to her: "The matter was secured with haste, and God willing it shall never be opened again." Nowhere did the letter specify what the matter was, yet the context made it unmistakable. Her breath caught as she realized that the counselors had not been merely preparing the Queen's body for burial. They had been protecting something that could unravel the monarchy from its foundations. She stared at the words for a long time, feeling the weight of centuries press against her, and in that moment she understood why her mentor had been so afraid. But knowledge is a difficult thing to bury once unearthed, and the historian found herself contemplating whether the truth was worth pursuing. She imagined the coffin resting in eternal stillness beneath the abbey, sealed in lead, untouched for centuries, guarding a secret that had outlived everyone involved. She wondered whether revealing that secret would bring clarity or chaos, whether it would deepen her understanding of history or fracture the nation's cherished myths. And she wondered, for the first time, whether the silence surrounding the coffin might not be an artifact of fear, but a protective barrier erected for the sake of the future, rather than the past. In the abbey, the lead coffin remained undisturbed, resting where it had been placed centuries earlier, untouched by cameras, scanners, or curious hands. Night after night, candles flickered in the surrounding halls, their light bending in faint, trembling arcs that seemed to acknowledge the presence of something beneath the stone. Those who passed near it felt an inexplicable tightening in their chest, a sensation they dismissed as imagination but never forgot. And somewhere in the dark quiet beneath the abbey's vaulted ceilings, the truth Elizabeth had taken to her grave lay perfectly preserved, waiting in the absolute stillness of leaden darkness. The world above grew louder, faster, more chaotic, but the coffin did not change. The silence around it did not waver. The unanswered questions did not fade. What waited beneath that slab of stone remained as potent as ever, held in place by centuries of fear, reverence, and unbroken secrecy. And although no living person had seen what lay within, the pressure of that truth pulsed faintly through history, urging the curious closer, warning the wise to turn away. The coffin waited, listening, as the world drew inexorably toward the moment when the silence would finally crack and the truth would demand to be known. In the years that followed the historian's discovery of that cryptic phrase buried in the council's letters, she found herself pulled into a quiet obsession, one that she confessed to no one as she navigated her daily life with the composure expected of a scholar while carrying within her a growing awareness that she had awakened something in her own mind that would not return to sleep. She avoided the abbey for months afterward, yet the thought of the tomb gnawed at her like a steady pulse felt beneath the floorboards of a silent room, unrelenting and patient. She tried to bury herself in unrelated research, but found her attention drifting back to the Queen, whose life had been documented with such precision and whose death had been handled with such terror. The historian understood that she stood at a crossroads, one leading toward academic safety and the other toward a dangerous pursuit that had consumed the lives of every person who had ever glimpsed beyond the surface of Elizabeth's carefully constructed legend. Eventually, her curiosity overcame her caution, and she returned to the Abbey under the guise of routine research. She walked through its vast halls with measured steps, her breath catching at the familiar blend of incense, dust, and centuries-old stone that filled the air with a quiet heaviness. As she moved past the tombs of kings and poets, her footsteps softened, as though instinct warned her to tread carefully in a place where the past felt not dead but waiting. And when she finally reached the section where Elizabeth's coffin rested beneath the floor, she paused, struck by a sensation she had never before experienced in almost electric tension, as though the very air around the tomb was charged with an awareness that did not belong to mere stone. Standing there, she felt the centuries compress around her, the countless decisions and silences that had accumulated like sediment over the truth inside the coffin. She imagined the attendants wrapping the Queen's body with trembling hands, the ministers hovering in fear, the physicians dying one by one, the quick sealing of the coffin, the swift burial in lead, the endless refusals to open it. All of it converged in this one place, this one slab of stone that separated her from the final piece of a story that had been smothered but never lost. For a moment, she thought she could hear something beneath the silence, an echo without sound, a presence without form, a question without words, and she stepped back, her heart beat loud in her ears, unsure whether the sensation came from within her or from something deeper, darker, older. In the days that followed, she felt herself changing. She began waking in the night with the sense that she had forgotten something important, something on the edge of consciousness. She found herself reading the same documents repeatedly, as though some hidden meaning lay between the lines, waiting to be discovered. When she walked through the streets of London, the Abbey's looming presence seemed to follow her, casting a shadow in her thoughts no matter how far she strayed from its physical location. She recognized these signs as obsession, but it felt too late to free herself, as though the secret inside the coffin had chosen her, as though it had been waiting for someone who understood both the importance of truth and the danger of unearthing it. One evening, overwhelmed by the weight of her thoughts, she returned to the Abbey after closing hours with permission to conduct archival work. The corridors were dim, lit only by a few lanterns placed sparingly along the walls, and the silence felt thicker, more intimate, like a presence enfolding her. She moved slowly toward the area nearest the tomb, her footsteps impossibly loud against the stone floor, each echo trailing behind her like a whisper. The historian knew she should remain in the archives, focus on her assigned work, but something stronger than intention guided her steps, something like a pull from the floor itself. When she reached the slab of stone marking Elizabeth's tomb, she stopped and sank to the ground beside it, her fingers hovering an inch above the cold surface. For several minutes, she remained there, breathing shallowly, feeling as though she had stepped beyond the boundary between observation and participation. She imagined the coffin beneath the stone, the lead casing embracing a skeleton that had never known the scrutiny of science. She imagined the pelvis that could answer every question, the bones that carried the truth of Elizabeth's identity, the truth that had terrified those who prepared her body for burial. And as she pressed her palm flat against the stone, a chill ran through her so violently that she gasped aloud, withdrawing her hand as though she had touched fire rather than cold. The sensation did not fade immediately. Instead, it lingered inside her, a thread of ice weaving through her thoughts. She rose unsteadily, retreating into the hallway, shaken by a feeling she could not rationalize. Logic told her it was imagination, the convergence of stress, exhaustion, and the haunting history of the place. But something deeper whispered that the sensation was real, that the coffin beneath the Abbey did not simply hold a secret, it emanated one. As she stood in the dim corridor, her breath visible in the chilled air, she realized something unsettling. For all the centuries of rumors and speculation, for all the fear and silence surrounding the coffin, the truth inside it had never been fully contained. It seeped outward in subtle ways, a presence that influenced the actions of those who approached, guiding them toward silence, toward retreat, toward abandonment of inquiry. Over the next week, she attempted to distance herself from her research, diving into other projects, meeting with colleagues, trying to restore the boundaries between herself and the past. But she found that the more she tried to escape the thought of the coffin, the more pervasive it became. She heard it in the rhythm of traffic outside her window, saw it in the shifting shadows of her apartment, felt it in the quiet moments when her mind drifted. It was as though the truth had followed her out of the abbey, attaching itself to her like a fragment of cold stone carried in a pocket. At last, she visited her mentor, now old and frail, but still possessing an unsettling acuity of perception. When she confessed that she had returned to the tomb, his reaction was instant and visceral. His hand trembled as he gripped the arm of his chair, his voice breaking as he told her she must stop immediately, that she must not seek further answers, that some truths were protected by history itself, not merely by institutions. He spoke of the instinctive terror he had felt decades earlier, the terror that convinced him to abandon his own research. He told her that there were secrets capable of devouring those who uncovered them, not through supernatural means, but through the psychological weight of knowing something a nation had rejected for centuries. As she listened, she felt a profound sadness settle over her. She realized that he was not afraid of the truth itself, but of the consequences of grasping it, of what it would mean for her, for history, for everything built upon the myth of Elizabeth. And as she left his home, she found herself standing on a quiet street, the cold night air wrapping around her like a shroud, and she wondered whether she had already ventured too far into the darkness of the past to ever fully return to the present. In the months that followed, she gradually stepped away from the research, not because her curiosity had faded, but because the weight of the truth had grown too heavy to bear alone. She locked her notes away, sealed her papers, deleted drafts of articles she had never dared submit. Yet even as she attempted to move forward, she carried with her an intimate, haunting understanding that Elizabeth's coffin remained the most potent unanswered question in English history. The abbey stood unchanged, its corridors filled with the footsteps of visitors who admired its beauty without sensing the tension beneath the stones. Elizabeth's tomb remained sealed, untouched, as it had been for centuries, and somewhere deep in the earth, beneath the weight of leaden time, a body waited silent, still, unexamined, containing not only the truth of a queen, but the truth of why entire generations had feared to look at her bones. The historian grew older, her life unfolding quietly, but she never forgot the moment she laid her hand on the stone above the coffin. She never forgot the chill, the silence, the weight of history pressing against her. And though she never spoke of it again, she carried within her the final understanding that the secret was not meant to be solved by her or anyone else. Some truths survive not through revelation, but through the refusal to reveal them. And beneath the abbey, the coffin waited, untouched, eternal, holding a truth England may never be ready to face, waiting in the dark, unbroken. A question older than any living soul, sealed in lead, guarded by silence, and destined, perhaps forever, to remain unanswered.